Okay, we're now beginning our new topic, which is approaches in psychology, and this video is looking at the origins of psychology. It's often been quoted that psychology has a long past but only a short history. And while psychology didn't emerge as a separate discipline until the late 1800s or so, its earliest history can be traced back to the time of the early Greeks and even the Egyptians, who began thinking about what governs human behaviour. The image that you can see on your screen here is what Greek physician Hippocrates thought about the four humours. So he developed this theory that blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm, the four humours of the body, influence our body and its emotions. So even the ancient Greeks in 400 BCE were starting to think about behaviour and emotion, which sort of started paved the way for early philosophers to start thinking about the mind and behaviour. The modern form of psychology was heavily influenced by the works of René Descartes, who you can see on your screen here, in the 17th century. And he spoke a lot about dualism, and he argued that the mind and the body were separate entities. Although not really what we believe in modern day psychology, this can sort of best be summed up as being a field of experimental philosophy. So, before we begin looking at the history of psychology, it's best to have a really clear definition about what it is. So if we break down this word psychology, this word psych, so this is Greek for mind, and logos for the study of. So here we can see that it's the study of the mind, although psychologists nowadays would argue that this is too narrow a definition. So the working definition of psychology is as follows. It is the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behaviour in a given context. And this is a definition that you should be adding to your glossaries. Okay, so that's what psychology is, but how did psychology as we know it begin? We can attribute psychology to this man here, Wilhelm Wendt, who is regarded as the father of psychology. He was the first person to call himself a psychologist. He opened up the first ever psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. And he wanted to study psychology, and he wanted to study the mind in a scientific way under controlled conditions. So he was inspired by the natural sciences like chemistry and physics and biology, who were developing ways using the scientific method to understand the components of substances, for example. And he thought the mind could be studied in a similar way. So he wanted to study the mind under scientific and controlled conditions. And this helped to move psychology from the philosophical roots, like we saw earlier with Descartes, to modern day science and scientific research. And he developed this movement called structuralism, which we'll look at a little bit more in a moment. But basically, he wanted to isolate the different structures of consciousness. He wanted to understand what was happening in the mind by breaking it up into the structures of the mind, like our thoughts and our emotions and our perceptions, etc. So he developed this idea of structuralism, and he's been accredited with promoting the use of introspection, which we'll look at in just a moment. So the use of introspection meant that Wilhelm Wendt was starting to think about studying the mind using standardized instructions and procedures, coming up with methods that would allow for reliable replication, and he wanted to emphasize the objective reporting of psychological phenomena. So when we talk about introspection, so Latin for looking in, and it really means looking within oneself and investigating and inspecting our inner world. So the aim of introspection is to systematically analyse human conscious experience. So it was the first experimental attempt to analyse human consciousness and what was occupying the mind. So he wanted to understand the structure of the mind by breaking conscious awareness into the basic structures of our thoughts, images, and the sensations that were appearing within our consciousness. So it's also known as experimental self-observation. So it was really training participants to carefully and as objectively as possible analyse the content of their own consciousness. So he would train himself and his participants, his lab assistants, to focus on a controlled stimulus, for example, a metronome, which you can see here in the top right-hand side. So he'd get them to focus on this everyday object. He'd present them with this controlled stimulus, and he'd ask them to reflect inwards and notice the thoughts that were coming to mind, the images that were cropping up, their emotional reactions, the sensations they were having, and to report on those experiences. So this meant that by training them to look inwards, and by giving them all of the same standardized and controlled stimuli, he was able to then see whether there was commonalities between what was making up people's consciousness. So in the same way that a chemist analyzes chemical compounds in order to get at the underlying structure, Wundt's aim was to take consciousness and break it down into its constituent parts. So that was the process of introspection, and we're going to have a go at doing that all together in one of our lessons this week. So although perhaps naive, Wundt really was the first person to try and attempt to find an objective and controlled and scientific way to study mental processes, and this led the way for later cognitive psychologists. Alright, so to evaluate Wundt's methods, we can't be too harsh. He is the father of psychology after all, and we've got a lot to thank him for. Although not particularly scientific, he was the first person to try and study the mind in a more scientific way. He used standardized instructions and procedures, so he controlled the stimuli, so for example a metronome or an image, and the tasks that participants were exposed to and were asked to reflect on and report about. His method allowed for somewhat reliable replication, so in his training of participants he was limiting the range of responses that they could give. So he was asking them only to report on the sensations they were experiencing at a particular time, or only on the thoughts or the memories that were appearing at a particular time. So by training them, they were able to give really detailed reports, and it was an attempt to be objective as well by getting them to all focus on the same thing, and by training them to try and remove themselves as much as possible from what they were experiencing and to try and report their experiences objectively. So it was the first attempt to study the mind scientifically, and we would not be where we are today in psychology without this. And he founded psychology as a science. So although we don't really particularly use introspection as a reliable method nowadays, although it is still used, particularly there's research even as recently as the 90s and early 2000s, which there was a study by Griffiths which used introspection to study the cognitive processes of people using a fruit gambling machine. So while they were gambling on that machine, they would ask the participants to think aloud while playing the fruit machine. So they were thinking aloud and talking into a microphone on their collar, so that they could gain some insights into what was happening in the mind of the person while they were gambling. So it is still used somewhat nowadays, although it's not obviously the best experimental method that we've got available to us. But he did help found psychology as a science. So modern day cognitive psychology is all about studying mental processes, so processes like memory and attention. And so this was what Wundt was attempting to do in the beginning by trying to study the mind in a scientific way. And he inspired others to also study behaviour and mental processes and the other areas of psychology that we're interested in a scientific way. So he not only led on to cognitive psychology, but the behaviourists, as we'll learn about later on, then also used scientific methods to study behaviour. However, although he began psychology as we know it today, his methods were not ultimately scientific. So there was over-reliance on unobservable phenomena. So when we're attempting to study consciousness, that is something that cannot be directly accessed, and we cannot study it empirically. It relies on self-report. So it relied on his lab assistants and his participants to report on their own experiences and their own consciousness. And as we know, this is quite difficult and is not objective. So this led to bias, of course, in the participants' responses. We know that whenever you're reporting on yourself, you're not necessarily honest, and you're not able to maintain a critical distance from your research, which is critical for scientific research. It's difficult to replicate, so there's a lack of reliability. Obviously, we know that our consciousness is fleeting, so even when testing the same participant from one moment to the next, there's going to be inconsistencies and there's going to be lack of reliability there. And of course, when we're comparing one participant to the next, there's also going to be differences and lack of reliability there as well. So this means that it's really difficult for us to establish any general rules or principles of behaviour through the method of introspection. Alright, so very, very quickly, let's take a little bit of a tour of the emergence of psychology. So back in 1879, this was when Wundt established his first psychology lab in Leipzig. And so this was really the first dedicated lab to psychological inquiry. So this was the beginning of psychology as a science. In the early 1900s, Sigmund Freud proposed the psychodynamic theory, emphasizing the role of the unconscious mind in determining our personality. In the early 1900s, 1913 particularly, we've got the emergence of the behaviorist approach, our first learning theory. So this was Watson and Skinner. They emphasized the role of learning. In the 1950s, we saw the emergence of the humanistic approach. So Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow devised this approach, emphasizing the whole person and their subjective experience, and they emphasized the role of free will in determining our behavior. In the 1960s, a busy time for psychology, we saw the cognitive approach emerge, which is investigating mental processes, and this emerged around the same time as computers, and that's why we see a lot of analogies taken from computer science and used in the cognitive approach. The 1960s, we also saw Albert Bandura propose social learning theory, emphasizing the role of observation and imitation in learning. In the 1980s, the biological approach becomes popular. So this was around the time that we had neuroimaging, and this was the time when we were understanding DNA a little bit better as well. And this emphasizes the role of the brain and the physical processes in determining behavior and mental processes. And then at the end of the 20th century, we saw a shift to cognitive neuroscience, which is combining elements of the cognitive and the biological approaches and emphasizes the role of those biological structures in determining thought processes. So a real whirlwind tour there of psychology as we know it today. We're going to be looking at each of these approaches in detail and in this order. And so you're going to become very, very familiar with the key assumptions of each approaches, the key researchers who contributed to our understanding of each approach. And then we'll be comparing them at the end of this topic.